Hi, everyone. Welcome. Feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I'm Eileen Jang Lynch, one of the curators of For Which It Stands. Along with Emily Alessandrini and Natasha Becker, we've conceptualized an evolving exhibition platform featuring contemporary artists who reinterpret and examine the iconic American flag and what it signifies. In the context of the country's complex and convoluted history and recent events, these artists provide new narratives surrounding forgotten or invisible histories and labor, identity, democracy, sense and politics of belonging, and other critical issues. For Which It Stands is delighted to partner with the Bronx Museum of the Arts and Rivers Institute of Contemporary Art and Thought on this program. Sanford Biggers, Sergio Bessa, and Andrea Andersson will be in conversation about Sanford's exhibition Codeswitch, currently on view at the Bronx Museum. The first survey of the artist's quilt-based pieces, this show features over 50 works that weave American history into a broader context of global traditions and styles. Sanford, Andrea, and Sergio will discuss the historical layers and plurality of the works in the show, including through the lens of language. One work in particular, Reconstruction, recontextualizes the American flag motif, as you can see behind me. Sanford Biggers is a New York-based interdisciplinary artist. His work is an interplay of narrative, perspective, and history that speaks to current social, political, and economic happenings, while also examining the context that bore them. Working with antique quilts that echo rumors of their use as signposts on the Underground Railroad, he engages these legends and contributes to this narrative by drawing and painting directly onto them. Sanford was awarded the 2017 Rome Prize in Visual Arts. He has also had solo exhibitions at the Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Brooklyn Museum, among others. In 2018, Sanford was awarded the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award. His work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., among others. Sanford also has a solo show at Marion Boesky Gallery through December 12th by appointment. Sergio Bessa is Chief Curator Emeritus at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, where he organized several exhibitions, including The Life and Times of Alvin Baltrop and Gordon Clark, an architect, in collaboration with Jessamine Fiore, and Martin Wong, Human Instamatic, in collaboration with Yasmin Ramirez. Sergio is a scholar of concrete poetry and author of Oyvind Fulstrom, The Art of Writing. Andrea Andersson serves as the founding director and chief curator of Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought, a multi-platform organization based in New Orleans. As a writer and curator, she has organized internationally touring exhibitions, and she co-edits a series of artist books together with Siglio Press, including Adam Pendleton, Becoming Imperceptible, Cecilia Vicuña, About to Happen, and Hinge Pictures, 8 women artists occupy the third dimension. Together, Sergio and Andrea co-organized and edited the exhibition catalog, Codeswitch. This show at the Bronx Museum will be traveling to the California African American Museum in Los Angeles in March of next year. For Which It Stands, thanks the Bronx Museum of the Arts and Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art, the Ford Foundation Gallery, and Assembly Room for this program. And of course, thank you so much, Sanford, Sergio, and Andrea, for being here with us today. Now I'm going to drop some links of the illustrated checklist and an interactive walkthrough in the chat that you can take a look at when you're available. And we're now going to stream a brief introduction with Sanford of the show, followed by a discussion. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section.
Welcome to Codeswitch here at the Bronx Museum. I'm Sanford Biggers. I'm very honored that this show is opening here at this specific location. I have a long-standing history with the Bronx Museum. In fact, the oldest work in the show Codeswitch is in the back room. It is on the floor. It's a projection of a mandala breakdancing floor. And that was filmed at the Bronx Community College back in 2000. And that floor was also exhibited here at the Bronx Museum around 2000, 2001. Not only is that piece of work to me, but hip hop is also a very important part of my aesthetic. This show is a visual journey through collage, patchwork, mashup, chopping and scoring, and sampling, which are the sonic backbone of hip hop. Most of the works here are works that are done on antique quilts that are from the pre-1900s. And I draw and paint and sculpt and rearrange and interweave them to create the works that you see here. And to find out more, please check out the catalog and the supplemental text that's surrounding this exhibition. And I hope you enjoy it.
And Eileen, you're going to put up a couple of other images. And I want to say on behalf of Sergio and myself, and also Sanford, a great thank you to the Ford Foundation Gallery and the For Which It Stands initiative, which welcomes us here today to hold some conversations we've been wanting to hold for a long time. And, you know, COVID gets in the way. So here we are, and I'm glad to say so. The For Which It Stands title of this particular initiative begs some questions around signification, around what a symbol stands for, what does it mean? And I'd like today to kind of pivot that question, that question to ask, how does it mean? Sergio and I have a long history together, but our history actually flows through a shared interest and conviction around histories and forms of poetry and poetics. So I think it's easy for me to say and to see that when we first came together to talk about this exhibition and our shared interest in working together to realize a survey of Sanford's Codex series, I speak for you a little bit, Sergio, here, but I think we both knew that we were not just talking about doing a show that was based in textile, but that we had some inkling that we were doing a show that had a lot to do with text, full stop. And so that may be not immediately apparent to everyone. So I thought we might take this opportunity today to unpack how this work operates in fields of signification and how these symbols might also stand for other kinds of systems that we're more familiar with. The image that we have up right now, I can say that when we were working on the book for Yale, I think we both got permissions for the same image from different places. So we're doubly permissioned, both from the Rauschenberg Foundation and also from MoMA. And we both were drawn to this image that we wanted to ensure that was in the book because, of course, this is a work in the history of the contemporary canon that really foregrounds a question of when does a quilt become a painting. The next image, however, is from a good friend of Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and I bring up this work to ask a different kind of question, which is when does painting become a form of language? And I will share that, this is a painting from 72, but already by 1960, Johns was already working with rulers, and those were, revisiting many of his paintings. During the same time, it has been, written upon quite a bit that Johns was reading a lot of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And that particular philosophy of language asks questions about or defines language and the many meanings that language might hold in relationship to the many uses that you give it, which is to say, a word has as many meanings as it has use. And there's a wonderful quote that I think many of us think of when we think of Jasper Johns, and Sergio and I were both talking about this morning. Take an object, do something to it, do something else to it. This seems to me a really great place to begin a conversation about quilts, Sanford, and what you do with them. Can we start here?
Sure, let's go.
All right, good. So one of the things that I love about John's paintings is that you can take a painting with a ruler and you can put it up against anything in your house and you can still measure with it. But of course, it does a lot of other things at the same time, or does many things within that painting. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the history of the material that you're using, these 19th century quilts, what their historical functions may have been, and how you might be adding to those operations.
Yeah, so my introduction to quilts as an art object, of course, when I was a student, I knew of the bed piece because it's, canonical as it is. But I had two experiences that really sort of led me down the path of working with them. And the first one was when the Gee's Bend quilt show was at the Whitney. And seeing, I was a grad student in Chicago, and I think I just finished my MFA. I was now living in New York City, and I had a very contentious relationship with painting. I was in a painting program. I didn't paint a single painting through that program. I instead worked all three-dimensionally or with sound and video. And that was the first time that I went to a show in that time frame that I was really inspired by. And it was for several reasons. The objects themselves were fantastic, but it was also the context of seeing them in the Whitney and what that automatically compared them to or put them on the same level as. And then considering that the makers, the women of Gee's Bend have been around for obviously several generations, but these are Black women who until that moment basically were practicing almost in secret, very local, regional at best. And to see there ended up having a political ramification, a class ramification, and I guess an attempt at a type of diversity, not only on a racial level, but on a gender level of positing these abstract works as paintings in the bastion of that whole genre of painting. So that was very inspiring. And then the second incident was I was invited to do an installation project in Philadelphia. And the idea was several artists were supposed to go to Philadelphia and reimagine specific locations that had fallen out of the memory of, the contemporary memory of people living in Philadelphia. And I initially started at the Masonic Temple. And I was really interested in the stained glass windows there and the patterned floors and the thematic rooms. They had rooms that were like the Africa room, the Oriental room. Yes, it was using all that nomenclature. It had all that sort of old school male secret society vernacular attached to it. And it was interesting. But then that same afternoon, I went to the Mother Bethel Church, which is one of the oldest documented pieces of Black real estate in the US. And not only that, it's also a church that housed escaping enslaved people. So as they were traveling from the South to the North, Philadelphia being one of the major hubs on the Underground Railroad, once people arrived there, that was one of the safe houses. So it already had enough lore that was bringing me in. But while I was looking throughout the church, I went downstairs and they happened to have had a small exhibition of quilts. And the quilts started to speak to me in the same way that the stained glass windows were. Patterns, colors, narrative potentially. And in that trip, after going to several other sites, I wound up at yet another exhibition that I think was at Temple that had quilts. And that's where I learned of this contentious narrative or historical narrative of quilts being used along the Underground Railroad as signposts. So as escaping enslaved people are coming up north and they see a quilt hung a certain way or folded a certain way or representing a certain pattern, there were directions and codes within that to read to help to go to safety. So that really blew my mind. And whether it was true, whether it is true or not, the fact that that history and that story has survived over hundreds of years at this point serves as, it shows its importance as vernacular culture. And I think the quilts are part of vernacular culture too. In the US particularly, we have a lot of nostalgia and put a lot of certain reminiscence and what's a good word for it? Nostalgia into quilts. So I want to use that because once again, it's already very loaded, but visually they're also very compelling. And so I started to do various experiments and paintings and drawings and interventions on them to, and which have persisted for over 10 years now, to just push those materials to the extreme.
Mhm.
So Sanford, if I can jump in here, I would love if you could just explain a little bit more about thinking of painting to intervene in the quilt making. And also having in mind that you just mentioned that when you were in college, you were in a painting major, but also you sort of had some kind of resistance to that. So when was that resistance finally, got passed over and became sort of a strategy to approach these quilts, which I think that's such a seminal coup in this body of work.
I think it also applies to the first question. Is I started my relationship with painting changed pretty much the first week when I started my MFA program, and I had an instructor who was very. His belief was that political art does not exist, that it can do nothing outside of just being art, and this was one of the his soapbox messages throughout that course. But I personally had already had experiences where I was doing mural projects in Watts and in Nickerson Gardens in LA, and knowing that putting a community mural up and working with people from that community automatically sort of lessened degrees of violence and crime around that area because of community engagement and all these other sort of particular things that you find out through other avenues, not typically through artistic practice. And so I knew that there was something wrong with that, but then that dialogue was so pervasive while I was in school that it really deterred me. And I found other ways to work, because painting to me really at that point became merely representational. And I wanted to make things that were more maybe confrontational or more physical, and were objects that the viewer really had to contend with on their own. So when it comes to the quilts, I found that linguistically, to take that object that was already operating on a certain level and then to do all these other interventions on it, gave it another life. It no longer, because of the language we've developed in contemporary art, it no longer was just a quilt. It was a canvas, it was a ready-made, it was speaking of art history. But when you start to think about the connotations of working with a quilt, someone's quote unquote women's work and craft materials and so on, then you start to interject certain political and socioeconomic readings into it. So the quilt itself became very fertile to work with. And then what does it mean when I embellish? Am I embellishing or am I vandalizing? And there's something political even in that. So that's sort of how I got over the hump with painting. And painting just was sort of second nature to me. It was in my hands. So that was the procedure that allowed me to work on them. And in the early stages, it was a very heady thing because I was thinking about it so conceptually and thinking about these on so many levels. But gradually, the hands started to take over, and I found ways to work within each quilt, because each quilt, of course, poses its own different design, compositional, and material problems.
I'd love to kind of pull us back, or I should say, pay a little bit of attention to the way language has been operating in your work at the level of titles, right? For those of you who have had the benefit of recently also seeing not only Codeswitch, but Soft Truths, when I walked through that exhibition with you, Sanford, I think I was audibly laughing a lot. You work with very heady material, but there is so much, and here I'm going to kind of borrow language perhaps from, because it seems quite right for your work, from architecture, but there's kind of linguistic trompe-l'oeil happening all of the time. There's double, triple, quadruple entendre happening all of the time. I think that there is a kind of demonstration of your practice at the level of just how you name something that is illustrative, or at least on the work, operating on the same plane as you are with other forms. And I think when I'm trying to, if I'm trying to make a case today that says something about your practice as being fundamentally linguistic in its operation, I think it is because you do with materials also what you do with language. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the titles of your projects, going back in time, but also very specifically about some of the titles of your codex works.
Yeah, so that is another way of sort of embedding it with more information. I know that these can be seductive objects, and that is something that's actually very important to me. I love that seduction of the visual experience. But anyone who sort of has a background of art making definitely can see that there's a lot more going on when it comes to me dealing with materials. And for those people who are not necessarily makers, but also sense that there's something more there, the titles give an opportunity to further complicate or elucidate whatever might be happening, what my intentions might be per quilt. So for example, let's see, I think there's one in my studio right now that's called Fractal Sankofa. And of course, we're talking about quilts that are based on patterns, and patterns having a relationship to fractals, and Sankofa being a term, an Odinkra symbol actually from one of the cultures in Africa that actually, the description of it is to look back and gather wisdom from the past to move forward. So in that process of naming a quilt that, which of course is an object for the past, is actually bringing that object into a contemporary dialogue. And, you know, to take it a step further, I actually see these being viewed years from now, so that the only information, when no longer people are looking at us talking on Zooms every day, all they really have is the object and the title. And that alone should spark enough interest and avenues to do research to find not only information about the quilt, but all the other underpinnings that go into the quilt. Another title, there's a piece in the show in Codeswitch called 100 Years Too Soon. And that is a direct lift of a quote from James Baldwin. But it also sort of implies that, I think the way he was using it was calling the emancipation of the US, it happened, or us celebrating it, we're celebrating it 100 years too soon, because in fact, we haven't really had true emancipation. And he was able to say that, I think it was in the 50s when he said that, or it may have been the 60s at this point when he said that. But for me to, I mean, we're still in that point. We're still trying to get to that. So they operate textually, but they also operate temporally, you know? So it's really about conflating meaning, material, and time.
Yeah, I think this is really, it's a great question, Andrea, and it's a really great explanation, Sanford, because I was thinking of something you mentioned recently in an interview, that you felt that this might be the most difficult part of your work, that some people will not be able to understand immediately. And I thought a lot about that. And I think it's all because of all these encoded layers and information that you kind of convey through this work. Would you care to expand a little bit on that?
Sure. I've always been a fan and very intrigued by works, not just of art, but of literature or even musical compositions that don't give it all up in the first go round. I love an album that I hate one year and then I fall in love with 2 or 3 years later and I can't live without. Because that becomes something that affects you on a cellular level. It's beyond just the visual level or surface level. And I find it a challenge, but it's a challenge that I'm willing to partake in almost every time I, embark on an artwork. Because yeah, as I mentioned before, there's a visual seduction, but I want there to be something beyond the seduction, In other words, I want you to wake up in the morning and still want to come back again. So I try to take that approach with each one, and each one is a challenge to me because it can't be that formulaic. It's not that formulaic to make that happen. I really have to sit and work with a quilt and the imagery that goes on it and the compositions. And sometimes I fail and sometimes I have to pull back and retreat and wait a while. But I know there's a certain point when all the engines start operating. And that's when I start to get stimulated, not just on the visual level, but on the metaphorical level, conceptual level, and so on. So I really would say that is characteristic of absolutely everything I've done, regardless of if it was a quilt work or a bronze or a marble sculpture or an installation or video. That is one of the things that I'm dealing with. So in that respect, this really is a language. My entire practice is about a language, and it's never about one specific work or series of works, but actually having the opportunity to understand and see it over time as a comprehensive body that is working on a hyper-linguistic level.
Yeah.
Sanford, I'm excited to ask you this question because it's very true to, I think, to your practice. We started this conversation by saying, you know, you started a practice by avoiding painting, so to speak. And yet it's this body of work, these paintings that I think I register, and I think you have even registered in our conversations before, as a kind of index, which is to say, you know, these works operate as index, not only because someone was here in the first place, right? There's this registration that there was a person who handmade these works, and that's always there. There's the touch of these soft textile-based works that operate over the course of history. But they're also really a form of, it's a way of indexing a practice, right? This body of work holds so many words, themes, motifs that figure across your body of work, whether that takes the form, as you're saying, as bronze, as you know, video work, as sound-based work. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, Sergio and I have had the honor of putting together this survey, which brings together many works from this series, over 50 works. But those works point in every direction. And I think when, you know, as we're talking about this work as being linguistic, I think what we're talking about is its polysemous nature, that it keeps pointing in all of these other dimensions. So can you talk about this body of work as not just a survey of the codex themselves, but a practice writ large?
Well, it's, once again, it's right there in the title, is that this body work is called the Codex because for me, it's literally a codex to understanding all of my other work. And, you know, many of us operate with a sketchbook and we write down our ideas or we do drawings and preliminary sketching and so on. I start to look at these quilts and even the smaller versions, which are like quilt constructions and works on paper, as literally my sketchbook. These are works that I could typically make on my own, and I can improvise on them and I can grow with them over time. I don't have to work with a team to complete them, which I might have to do with larger installation projects and so on. So in that way, it becomes sort of an ongoing palimpsest of my ideas. And to read them, you start to see them touch upon the bronze works, the sound works, the multimedia projects and everything. So that's literally how it operates. And in that respect, it's been ongoing because of that. It's because this is sort of the repository of all the ideas. They happen right there and I work them out. They literally end up being sketches because I'm thinking of other projects as I'm making these symbols. So it's a schematic. It's literally a codex of reading my body of work.
In addition to that, I think you know, this linguist element of it is of course very present and central to the work. But I think also, and that's one of the things that I thought was most fascinating when I began to really get into this work, is how you handle history, which I think for me has always been, whether in poetry or in painting, or, you know, to deal with history is such a delicate thing because, you know, most often it can become an illustration of history. You know, it's like Washington crossing the Delaware. And, or you can make a spoof on that, like Coast Guard, for example, you know.
Sure.
But I think the way you deal with history is really exemplary, you know, and I think, you know, of course, you're still a very young man, but I think a lot for younger artists to look at the way you deal with history, for me has been a lesson, you know. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think if I were to analyze it, in some ways, that part, I mean, there's a few things. I'm deeply influenced by surrealism in its very earliest form, in the way that it can parody and satirize and use dark and Black humor to elucidate ideas and feelings of despair sometimes and hopelessness. But it still can do it with a bit of irony and a twist of humor, which is, you know, what you've already commented on before in my work. And then thinking about history and all these elements in a very abstract way. So in that respect, I think my practice becomes almost reductionist. So rather than try to make an image or refer to history visually, the objects themselves are history. You feel the history, you see the rips and the wear and the tear. So there's that respect. And then even the symbols and the graphics and the lines and the reference imagery references that are on top of the quilts are taken from so many different places, from architectural diagrams, from comic books, from graffiti, black books that I used to keep as a kid, from advertising to Japanese mon or family crests, and basically equating them, conflating them and equating them, neutralizing them, so that no longer are we looking at the African or the South American imagery as something that belongs in the encyclopedic museum in this sequestered area, but now it's back in the main room, in the contemporary room, and it's in dialogue with Greco-Roman references and so on. And I'm getting rid of that sort of hierarchical canonization of these forms of work. So I think I might be answering your question. I might just be.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's something that we can talk a lot about, because it
Oh, I'm sorry, not to interrupt you. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to finish the thought about history is sort of reducing things, but also looking at history as a malleable material, because we're always learning about new facts and information that debunk formerly ideas that we thought were historical fact. And if that is a process, it's an ongoing process. And I really enjoy playing linguistically with that phrase that history is written by the victors, when we live at a time where information is basically open source. So that gives me the ability to rewrite history.
Right.
I love to think about, I kind of crack up. I mean, I wrote about this in the book that we realized for this project, but it was when I was writing about your work as history painting, as contemporary history painting, it frankly made me giggle, because I can't think of anything more boring for me. There are going to be many scholars who live this stuff, but I remember sitting in art history classes, looking at old history paintings, and this is the stuff of old white male painting that I think at those moments I was doodling in my pad. But of course, this is also the origin of allegorical painting, right? And so while formally your work could not be more different in its multimedia and complexity of kind of competing and resonating media, there is this very traditional standpoint, which is to say that you are engaged in a long history of layered palimpsestual, one thing meaning another thing meaning another thing. And this is the Romantic ruin, except the ruin that we're looking at is actually fairly recent American history. And I think that there is, for which it stands is, on the one hand, is a question about what does something mean, but it's not just what does a symbol stand for, but it's also what does a subject believe in, right? I mean, there's an ethics to this expression for which something stands. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, if we're talking about the ruins of American history, does this work operate in a particular belief system? And that might be a formal belief system, and that might be an ethical belief system, but I think that they're connected.
Wow. Good question. Well, definitely, I think it is engaging in a formal belief system, and it's really a conversation through the history of mark making, and like you said, palimpsestual work, and a lot of allegory. I mean, a lot of the titles even start to equate these artworks with things that you would never previously put them together with, and that's to draw some connection that the viewer then has to negotiate themselves. So on in the other side of that it's a not necessarily political or social belief system. I have my own, which I don't really like to illustrate that much in my work. I'm more interested in making everybody rethink all of these structures, and to recognize even our moment, as cataclysmic as it feels, is in a long, long history of ruin, a long history of fallen societies. Societies fall, they rebuild. Living in Rome for a year and literally looking at the remnants of several thousands of years of creation and destruction, ruination and repeat. Seeing ourselves within that timeline makes this work for me. It makes me want to have people reinvestigate how they're positing themselves in this moment and how they're seeing this moment against time, themselves against time, and how do we all move forward from here.
So I think we're getting close to the end, and I would like to address one specific work in the show, which was actually the work that prompted this program today, which is reconstruction. And I just want to preface by saying that Andrea and I worked very hard to secure this work for the exhibition. We felt that it was fundamental to having the exhibition, and we actually put it right at the offset. So of course, we read so much about reconstruction and the significance of that in American history. But Sanford, I would love to have your take on their work and the historic period and so forth.
Yeah, so this it's a very evocative piece, and it's a very reductivist piece. And I say that because the structure that it's on, obviously is referencing origami and pyramids and modular design systems and Buckminster Fuller and Jaewon Chu and origami paper traps and so on. It goes on and on. And what appears to be an American flag, in fact, really is a quilt that used aspects of flags in it, but in and of itself was not a flag. But of course, it refers to that. And I think about Reconstruction in terms of American history a lot because, it's sort of indicative of where we are right now, of another failed experiment. But I call this reductivist because it's really just a reconstruction of a quilt at the end of the day. Let's cut all the politics out of it. It's a reconstruction of a modular form and a reconstruction of a quilt, and people can read and project as much as possible as they want onto this. But it really is what it is. It's a reconstruction that obviously references many more things. So I think it's almost indicative of my project as a whole. But as a backbone to this, I've worked with American flags since I was a teenager. When I was learning how to paint with oils, I did paintings of flags. I did paintings of flags burning. I even had an incident when I was a college student in Atlanta, Georgia, when I was part of a sculpture competition for the city, of the whole city. I was the youngest participant, and I was actually competing against grad students and some emerging artists. And I did this strange metal sculpture, which was basically a disc, a welded disc on a wall. And I buffed and polished it till it was almost like a mirror. And then hanging from that was a very rusty link chain that went down to the ground. And when it reached the ground, it wrapped around a Georgia state flag. It's a flag that I literally found in a trash can. And the Georgia state flag at that time still had the Confederate flag inside of it. And I ended up winning second place in this contest. And the paper came to take pictures of it. And they wouldn't take a picture of it with the flag in it. So I stood in front of it and said, then you can't take a picture of the piece at all because you're not honoring the piece. And just giving you a background of how many times I've attempted to use the flag, and then I stopped for many years because it's just so loaded. But it made sense right now, and that piece came together in such a fluid fashion. And my mindset in going into it as a reductionist piece allowed me to create that. So.
I can't help myself, but of course acknowledge that, we're talking about the American flag here with Reconstruction and this power symbol. Jasper Johns also thought a little bit about the American
Sure.
To bring us full circle. But what we're talking about, both with his practice and being able to reuse these things and put them to new use, and your practice is also something that you've talked a lot about, which is your engagement with power objects. And I think, the American flag is but one of those. But when you've spoken about them before, what I think is most compelling is your sensitivity here to the fact that power objects are not static objects. They operate in histories, and they are constantly changing thereby. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about your relationship to them and how you understand them operating.
Yeah, I think it's, that's an extension of the idea or the belief that history itself is a malleable material. I think a successful artwork is never fixed or static in its meaning. And as society and culture evolves or devolves around it, the meaning often changes as well. So, you know, we often see this when, I mean, just look at the monuments that are being destroyed and what they meant for some people years ago and what they mean for other people now. And then you have a camp that wants to get rid of them all. And then you have another camp that says, do graffiti, deface them, do whatever, but leave them so that we remember the history. So I'm really interested in how we not only deal with history, but how these objects can also work the same way. And that's why I often refer to power objects in my sculptures, because they are called power objects for a reason. I think art objects are power objects because we do imbue them with power. We put analytical power, economic power, we put all of this power into them. So they still do operate in a very unique way within society. I'm interested in making work that can actually operate on most of those cylinders. That, you know, it's never just about one approach or one viewpoint. It's more a both and, not either or situation or equation, in my opinion.
Well, there is another aspect of the flag also, that it's such a trope in folk art, you know, in American folk art. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jasper Jones kind of picked on that. And I think a lot of people misunderstood his intent when he first began to show that, because it was such a, you know, let's say a corny kind of subject for a painting. So, but that I'm thinking, you know, as I think about that, I think also in relation to the quilts, which again, it's folk art, and you know, you're kind of tapping on this really the core of Americana, so to speak, you know, so the quilts, the American flag, and so forth. So we, Andrea, we begin to have some questions. I don't know if you have any follow-up on this, or should I read some questions?
I'm open to questions, yeah.
Okay, so there is one question from Frank. He says, would love to know if these quilts as a base or matrix are existing, recreated, and how do you feel about the preservation of these objects?
Well, surprisingly, I mean, I'm working on, most of these quilts are pre-1900 and they're actually in really good, strong, durable condition. The longevity that I do not know, nor do I know our longevity. So I don't get too stuck on that part. Also being power objects and also being a study of wabi-sabi and living several years in Japan and knowing a lot about the tea ceremony and the profundity in non-quote unquote perfect objects, I think a certain amount of decay is actually a certain amount of ripening, and that becomes the patina ultimately that makes these pieces resonate. So they are at once contemporary and historical objects. So the whole project is, you know, predicated on the assumption that there will be some amount of decay. And even in the titles, it's really about evolving and moving, and, you know, it's always a work in project and a work in process that way. Just like the American flag, I think that's a work in progress too. So that's why we can always use it.
Sanford, I might just add to that. I mean, I think one of the real privileges that Sergio and I enjoyed in terms of working on with this body of work was also to see the Codex series evolve itself. I mean, these, you know, to walk through the exhibition and to recognize works that were earlier in their making versus the most recent works. I mean, you are not literally, but in our world of digital play, you appear to be standing before one of the works that's currently on view in Marion Boesky now from Soft Truths. This is a really different work than, for example, some of the other quilts that we see in the show. And one of them, one of the main differences I'm just looking at here is, and I particularly like to note this while we're talking to Sergio, of course, who organized the a recent exhibition on Gordon Clark's work, but the place of voids figures in a very different way in some of the more recent quilts than, you know, your earliest interventions, which is a different kind of liberation, right? It's or taking liberties with some of these materials. So somewhere in what I'm saying is a question which has something to do with the role of voids, has something to do also with the way that you are treating quilts differently today than perhaps you were 10 years ago.
Well, I like to set up obstructions or challenges for myself formally, as a, just an artist in the studio. And one of them Sergio tapped on before was this idea of taking, craft, hokey, quote, low materials, but elevating them, trying to transcend them, make them become something other. And now once they are in a museum, they're read a certain way and they take on a different type of meaning. And that was one of the challenges. How do you make this material that is stepped on or slept on and forgotten and turn it into something that becomes a conversation, a deeper conversation piece? Mm-hmm. And another obstruction was, okay, so I've done years of an additive process. Let's reverse that. Let's go to a reductive or subtractive process. And I started to really experiment with the void. And I've always considered the void to be an extremely important compositional tool, whether it be in visual works or even in sound works. I mean, you think of John Cage or even Miles Davis. And when you get to the point, I mean, there's even a metaphor amongst the music community that the greatest vocalists consider silence to be part of their voice. Mm-hmm. It's not about belting the song out. It's about when do you pull back and restrain. And this show, the Soft Truth show at Marianne Boesky, is an exercise in that. The pieces there are in some ways minimal in terms of the procedure to make them. And that was a challenge. And I wanted to bring out a different compositional tool that ended up becoming a different sort of visual and spatial tool. Because in the Soft Truth shows, these are coupled with marble sculptures, large marble sculptures, some of them weighing more than a ton. So in my mind, I'm seeing this as volume versus void, or volume and voids in consort together.
So that's really great, because the next two questions, we can actually mash the two together. One is from Elena Herzog, and she asks for you to explain more what you mean by reductive. Mm-hmm. And the other one is from Aurelio Del Muro, who's an educator at the Bronx Museum and also a musician. And he sees a lot of jazz in your work, and particularly in Quilt 28. So he would like for you to expand more on music. So it's great where you came from, because you can
that's what
Yeah, so for the first part of that, I personally sort of think the sign of a master creator is the ability to say as much as possible with as little as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that is just like, oh, just a blank canvas and I've done the thing. It's more about going through the process of really exploring, mining through material and mining through the work to find, okay, now that I've done that and experienced what I can accomplish with aspects of that, what happens when you pull back and you pull things out, when it's a minimal amount of moves, gestures, references, and in this case, even the one behind me, space itself. And I'm not saying that I'm always going to be in a reductivist mode, but it is something that I think is very important for me at this time to deal with, especially because I sort of work in a contrarian timeline. As we've all seen with everything that's been happening in the US this year, there's a lot of bombast, there's a lot of noise, mm-hmm. There's a lot of fury and rage. And my impulse as an artist is to find a space within my work that doesn't match that tone, that actually uses different devices. So I think that's why I'm using the phrase reductivist there. And when it comes to music, jazz in particular, I listen to a lot of jazz, obviously, when I'm working, and I grew up listening to jazz, but I think everything we can talk about in terms of experimentation and composition and virtuosity, you can find by listening through the history of jazz music. And I think it's particularly important because that is an American construct. And when it really gets down to it, it's a Black American construct. Mm-hmm. That obviously has global ramifications. So I think it's always a good place to go back into jazz. A lot of people say they don't like jazz, but I'm like, you probably just haven't heard enough, because there's something out there for everyone to deal with. I mean, there's a Sun Ra and John Cage collaborative album. And we know that John Cage typically was not a fan of jazz. But those things happen because jazz is a free space where things can happen. Experimentation is warranted within it.
Yeah. I think this is great. I'm thinking, and I spoke about this in another talk, but there is so much mystification about jazz, and I think people just neglect to look at how much thought and how intelligent that music is. I was thinking particularly in that phase of Miles Davis when he begins to manipulate tape in the studio with Ted Machero, which is
My favorite.
amazing. And I think that's the beginning of your work, Sanford, and it's the beginning of hip hop and so forth. So I think people romanticize jazz with, you know, the smoking and the whiskey or whatever, but they don't see the, you know, the handcraft in making those amazing, you know, sound pieces. So.
And the risk taking, because you got to remember at that phase, that was right around the time Miles started turning his back on the audience, which everyone thought of as rude.
Yeah. But
he did that because he didn't want to be the spectacle. He didn't want to be just that guy up there performing for largely white audiences a lot of the time. Right. So he turned his back. And a lot of people started to not listen to him in that time frame because the music was just too difficult. It had electric guitars in there and you got tape splicing and all these early, what we take some of those technological things for granted now, but they were new then. And, you know, those albums got horrible reviews when they were contemporary. But a decade later, and now 40, 50 years later, they are some of the most important works that were made in the jazz canon.
Well, they are the present, right?
They are the present, exactly.
They're present.
They're the present.
And it's also, you know, I love, you just used the word, the kind of difficulty of that work. And I think that is a word I would also use to apply to your own practice. I mean, I think, you know, early work that I saw of yours, and I thought about this a lot when we started to do this project, because as we talked about this, the Codex series provided for me a real circuitry, a network through which to understand the points of relationship. But I think you know, when I think back on works from 10 years ago that were working in a lot of different forms and a lot of different genres, it was much, you know, there's a difficulty to knowing where does Sanford stand in relationship to this image or form, because I think you do refuse that in a wonderful way to locate yourself in relationship to all of these histories that you are in dialogue with. And so I wonder, you know, if you can speak a little bit about difficulty, like how does that function?
Yeah. Well, I mean, being totally transparent, I have consciously, I know that I've been making difficult work all of this time, and it's been difficult. You know, it's in some ways a blessing, some ways a curse. I've heard that conversation for decades. What is it that you do? What is your hallmark thing? And all these things, and I'm like, that's sort of not the point of what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to make a logoic, symbolic thing that you will always recognize as Sanford Biggers. In fact, I'm trying not to do that. I want to make things that grab you in and you want to learn more about the artist, and then you find out that it was me behind all of that work. And then why are those things connected together? That's really the end game, is to figure out why all those things are functioning on that level. And through that, expanding the way you're perceiving how an artist is supposed to, you know, how an author is supposed to write, or what is the trajectory of a creative endeavor. And I hope that influences people, and I hope it emboldens several artists not to feel that they have to be, you know, easily palatable or easy to be put into a category or a holding pattern, or to be typecast. So, you know, I took that as one of my obstructions, and one of my challenges is to try to create compelling work for 25 plus years without just doing one thing for 25 plus years. And hopefully I'll be able to do that for at least another 25 more. But that is what is interesting to me about being an artist, is the ability to use so many different forms to say so many things. And if there was anything I was to say to those people who say, well, you don't have a signature form, I think actually conceptually, they are all coming from the exact same nucleus. And that's the challenge, is for you to see how these all actually overlap and coincide. And, you know, as you're asking me this question, I'm thinking about that whole series. The Codex series was a way for me to even have a place to understand where it's all happening. So what people experience as individual paintings for me is a way of saying, oh yeah, so I was using some of those references there, and then I was doing that, and I was doing that, and now they're all together on these quilts. And these quilts are sort of explaining how these ideas are bobbing and weaving out of my own personal creative history.
Becoming new signposts. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A couple of other questions here, Sanford. I'll just read to you. So if you decide if you want to address, but it's clear that there in most of the quilts there is a lot of references to Japanese culture, and there is one listener here who would love if you could talk about the influence of Japan, of your experience of living in Japan in your work.
Yeah, so I lived in Japan from '92 to '95. And prior to that, I was an undergraduate student at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And my junior year, I spent in Florence, Italy. And while I was in Italy, I was studying art and Italian and traveling all over Western Europe at that time. And, you know, because that's what an artist is supposed to do. That's where the real stuff is. And then upon graduating, I was looking for an opportunity to get back on the road and get out of the country because on a personal level, I feel that all people from every country need to leave their country to understand their country and understand themselves a bit. And so in that process of finding a place to be, I wound up in Japan teaching English for 3 years. And while I was there, I became, you know, a lot of Japanese friends. I learned the language. I was fascinated by the multiplicity of that culture. The work culture, the pop culture, the music culture, the history, Buddhism, and so on. And I lived there. I mean, I lived it, and still to this day, I'm in contact with a lot of those people that I was involved with there at that time. And years after moving back to the US, I was invited again to Japan to do a residency. And at that time, I did a long-standing project with this Soto Zen temple outside of Tokyo, where I did several performances and sculptures and works based off of traditional Japanese concepts and, you know, contemporary American concepts and mixing it all together. So that's sort of a background of my experiences there. But that influence has never left me because I was just so struck by just ideas of design and space and expression and gesture or lack thereof, or subtlety. Really, it's more about subtlety of gesture. And in some ways, as influenced as Japan is by America because of various aspects of history, I think we operate on totally different levels. The US is a very egocentric, narcissistic place. It's all about the self. And Japan does not operate socially on that level. And it was a huge lesson because being a minority in the US, you often have to code switch and act various ways. So it's all very much related. I learned about code switching in a very different way when I saw a culture that had way more subtlety within their code switching.
Yeah. Beautiful. So Eileen is showing up again, so I think it's time to say bye. But I want to leave with this quote that Christine Myers just wrote to us, and she says, this is from James Baldwin. History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. So thank you so much, Sanford. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
And Andrea, we'll talk soon. Ciao, Eileen. Bye.
Ciao, everybody.
Sanford, big hug.